Tantor Audio presents Meet Me in Malmö, the first Inspector Anita Sundstrom mystery, by Torquil MacLeod, narrated by Marguerite Gavin. Prologue. It was the sound of the sickening thud that he would never be able to erase from his memory, and Alison vomiting straight afterwards. The evening had started out so well. John Wilson had thought that this was his lucky night. Ever since Freshers' Week, he had been trying to get close to the gorgeous Alison French, and then, quite by chance, he had run into her at a crowded end-of-term party in the Bailey. The willowy blonde with the easy laugh had, at long last, turned her winning smile on him. The fact that she had been full of the alcoholic spirit of pre-Christmas probably helped. But there had been no sign of the rugby-playing boyfriend, so the field was clear. He had been astonished to find himself standing with his arm round Alison's shoulder in front of the brooding expanse of Durham's medieval cathedral. In the darkness of the early December evening, the illuminated western towers and the even larger central one appeared to commune with the night sky. Alison had shivered, and John had clenched her closer. She had responded and raised her head to his. They kissed, just as they had done when they had staggered out of the party 15 minutes earlier, after he had gallantly offered to see her back to her college across the river. He hoped that this spark of affection hadn't been ignited solely by the drink. She had certainly downed a lot of fancy-looking concoctions, and she'd swayed slightly as he'd manoeuvred her along the Bailey and up towards the cathedral. John knew the lights would be going out soon, so he had begun to move Alison away from the main door of the cathedral. As he did so, he glimpsed the lion-like beast that was the famous sanctuary knocker. He suddenly got an overwhelming sense of history. Perhaps it was the alcohol, but he could almost feel the presence of all the souls who'd sought safety in the cathedral over the centuries. He drew the obvious parallel. He felt he'd found refuge with Alison, and life could only get better. They had made their way unsteadily across the grass and round a couple of old tombstones until they were close to the cathedral wall, the central tower looming above. There were some muted sounds of a party going on somewhere nearby, but Palace Green, opposite the cathedral, was quiet. John glanced round and saw that all was deserted. This was his moment. He took Alison's face in his hands and stared into those twinkling, if slightly inebriated, eyes. "I've waited so long for this moment." She blinked before smiling back. "Do you want to come back to my room tonight? Claudia won't be there. She's round at Andy's." John could hardly contain his excitement. Alison grabbed his hand. "Come on." But they only managed to take a couple of steps near the promised delights of Alison's room. A piercing scream startled them and broke the evening's calm serenity. They hardly had time to look up when the body of a woman hurtled past their heads and landed in front of them, half bouncing off the grass before slumping down like a rag doll, its limbs all distorted. Alison was yelling in fright. The lights on the cathedral snapped off. 25 years later. Chapter 1. She was sitting in front of the mirror. The reflection staring back was beautiful. In her early 40s, she could pass for someone far younger. The natural blonde hair was shoulder-length, framing a face with high cheekbones that gave it a sculpted look. Yet the deep blue eyes ensured that the overall effect was not that of marble, but full of life. The mouth was wide, a slash of exotic red across cool Scandinavian features. The black dress plunged invitingly, but it was the necklace that caught her attention. The amber glinted in the discreet mirror light. She played with it thoughtfully. A half-smile crossed her lips. Then a noise disturbed her, and her expression changed. She looked round. The sound of someone in the next room, perhaps. Her hand went to her throat, and her face creased into puzzlement. Yes, there was definitely a person moving around in the next room. "Rune!" she called out cautiously. There was no reply. She stood up slowly. This was a woman who was ready to go out to somewhere smart. The dress was short enough to show that she still possessed head-turning legs, but long enough to hint that not all was on show. Well, not yet. With a certain amount of trepidation, she crossed the bedroom to the door, which was slightly ajar. The room was decorated and furnished in understated Scandinavian elegance. No clutter, no extravagant adornments, nothing that wasn't of some use. She stopped and gingerly opened the bedroom door. Oh, it's you." She sounded disappointed, but the nervousness was gone. The object of her disappointment was just out of sight, behind the now open door. "What are you doing here?" She jerked back instinctively as male hands made a grab for her throat. She gurgled helplessly as the fingers pressed around her neck. For a few seconds she tried hopelessly to break the vice-like grip, but she hadn't the strength. The powerful hands were pushing her down onto her knees, her skirt riding up as she went. The unequal struggle ended with her slipping slowly to the floor, all the elegance draining away as fast as her life. The unseen assailant released his grip. Then the door closed, and the body was left in a still heap. Ewan Strachan shifted in his seat. He could never sit still, however riveting a film was, but this one didn't come into that category. Was it really that easy to strangle someone? He was sure it wasn't, but that was the magic of the movies. And Christina had it coming to her because she had been starting to annoy him. Even he would have been tempted to do her in, but he presumed he wouldn't find out who'd done it until the final reel. Yes, she was very beautiful, but some of the lines she had come out with were cringe-making. Of course, that could be down to the translation. You were never sure with subtitles. Ewan cast his eyes round the small but packed cinema. Most of the audience was concentrating fully on the action, or lack of action, until the moment when Christina had copped it. But these were fans of Swedish cinema, and particularly of the director, who was sitting in the front row watching his wife, Malin Lovgren, die dramatically on screen. He was surrounded by disciples. In the question and answer session that followed the screening, there would be no dissenting voices, not even Ewan's. He wouldn't get an interview with Mick Roslin by being critical beforehand. Sitting 5 rows in front of Ewan, he still had that familiar long, dark, swept-back hair and the neatly barbered stubble. Not grey hair in sight, despite his 45 years. He has certainly aged far better than I have, thought Ewan, who had now lost interest in Gassen, or the geese. Ewan still hadn't worked out how geese fitted into the story, though maybe there was some obscure Swedish metaphor for strangulation, long necks, easy to wring, or pecking. The Christina character had henpecked her poor husband, who was perfectly justified in murdering her. She hadn't been very nice to her lover, either. Then again, it might be to do with flight. He would have to come up with something to put in his review. He had to justify his train fare from Newcastle to Edinburgh for the Northern Stars Film Festival, but if he could grab Rosalind for a quick interview afterwards, then even his pain-in-the-arse editor might get off his back for a while. It was a matter of getting Rosalind alone for 5 minutes. It might help if Mick remembered him. The chance of visiting a prestigious film festival had seemed fanciful only 2 weeks before. "You've got to get off your arse and do something interesting," Brian Fletcher had said as he tried to remove some wax from his ear with his finger. Ewan couldn't look. What would he do with it if he got the wax out? The operation was unsuccessful, and Brian sat down behind his desk in his cramped office. All the offices assigned to the Novocastrian News, or Novo News as it had become, because management felt the name was snappier, were small. It was a small operation, run by a big local Newcastle-based newspaper group. They had created the bi-monthly Novo News magazine as a vehicle for attracting extra advertising revenue. It was also a good place to hide away their journalists who could no longer do the business, or had never really been able to in the first place. Ewan often wondered for which group he qualified. He hoped it was as a hack who could no longer hack it. At least that meant he hadn't always been useless. Brian, on the other hand, always had. But that didn't stop him thinking that he was a born editor, and that any day soon his genius would be recognised and a really good job offer would come along. Your arts reviews lack punch. Sometimes I wonder if you actually go and see the things you're meant to be reviewing. And when was the last time you got a decent interview? Ewan could have answered, if he had been asked, by pointing out that the group's morning and evening papers got first stabs on anybody in the arts world who was of the remotest interest: leading theatricals, controversial artists, top dancers, even the occasional film star. He was left with all the obscure woodcarvers, pretentious potters, and loopy candlemakers who seemed to emerge every summer in the touristy bits of the northeast. It hadn't always been like this, even though Ewan's own career hadn't been much more glorious than Brian's. The boys upstairs have been moaning. They think Novo should be more dynamic, and arts and social is an important ingredient in our mix. Don't let me down again. Get something fascinating enough to fucking print, or I'll have to find someone else who can. After leaving Durham University with high hopes of a stunning journalistic career, Ewan hadn't returned to his native Edinburgh. To parochial, he had pronounced grandly. He did what he saw as his apprenticeship at a couple of very local newspapers, both of which turned into free sheets and were more interested in advertising revenue than news gathering. Yet when he did have the chance to move south, he opted for Newcastle. On the evening paper, he did general reporting, before a move to the more prestigious regional morning. He wanted to specialise in crime, nitty-gritty stories. There was certainly enough villainy around Tyneside and its environs to justify a crime correspondent. But the editor, under pressure from the managing director, vetoed the idea. It would send out the wrong signals about the region, so he was attached to the sports desk instead. Funnily enough, he quite enjoyed it for a while. As a huge proportion of the Geordie population was far more interested in sport than in anything else, it proved quite lively at first. But then he got bored, got sloppy, and got shoved onto Novo News. Now he rejoiced in the title of Arts and Social Correspondent. He found it difficult to muster the required enthusiasm, as he wasn't very interested in the arts and he wasn't very social. But it was a living, of sorts. I hear what you're saying, Brian. I'll dig up something that will please upstairs. Ewan stood up and put his hand on the door handle. And you? Had he managed to keep the sarcasm out of his voice? He wondered. Brian gave him a sceptical look before nodding. Yes, he had. Ewan went out into the main open-plan office. It was only open-plan, inasmuch as there were 5 desks squashed into the one room. He sat down at his computer and stared at it blankly. Opposite, Mary grinned at him. Her hair was a funny off-orange at the moment, and she never looked right without a cigarette hanging out of the side of her mouth. In this no-smoking building it meant frequent trips to the back door, where she and Ewan used to put the world to rights. Well, Novo News to rights. Another bollocking? She asked. Her lined face was creased up in amusement. Fortunately for her, retirement was only a year away. Not dynamic enough, apparently. Then he burst out laughing. Come on, time for a fag break. They made their way along a series of drab corridors. How have I ended up here? Ewan thought for the 1000th time. How come my great dreams have turned into a feckless career? Why have I never escaped the northeast of England? Many people had asked him that. He made various excuses, most of which weren't believed. Yet, if he was honest with himself, and that had rarely happened in his 45 years, he knew he could never give them the real answer. Ewan walked through the large wooden doors and up the wide stone steps of the Newcastle Literary and Philosophical Society. Ahead of him was a large white statue of James Losh, recorder and eminent businessman of Newcastle in the 1800s, although he actually hailed from Cumberland. High on the imposing walls, classical grand relief figures showed that appropriate homage had been paid to the mathematical and philosophical influences that had been taken from ancient Greece. There were portraits, too. Robert Stevenson was there, as one of the many important scientific industrial figures who had been members. Lord Armstrong, warships, Sir Joseph Swan, the electric light, and Sir Charles Parsons, turbine engines, were all to be found on the wooden honours board, proudly proclaiming past presidents. When he reached the first floor, swing doors opened into a huge L-shaped room. Tightly packed books rose up from the floor to a gallery with a brass handrail all the way round, then from the gallery floor almost to the ceiling of this huge space. Beyond the reception desk there were leather armchairs, a round table near the coffee hatch, and then, round the corner, long tables and assorted chairs, in between further stand-alone wooden bookcases. It was Dickensian. It was unhurried. It was charmingly decrepit. It was Ewan's sanctuary. In the lit and fill he could escape Brian, the Novo News, and the other aspects of his life that he wanted to forget about. Here, over a paid-for coffee and one free biscuit, he could read the national newspapers, delve into obscure ancient books, or plan the novel he knew he'd never write. No mobile phones were allowed. No phones of any kind could be heard. However, quiet talking was tolerated, so conversations could be struck up with some of the more eccentric members, which often proved entertaining and enlightening. One newspaper he always made a beeline for was the Scotsman. Why the library stopped it he had no idea, but it was good to catch up with the happenings in Edinburgh. Though only an hour and a half away by train, he rarely returned home. Both his parents were now dead, and his brother, a successful lawyer, just annoyed him. Most of his old school friends had either moved on, or he had lost touch with them. However, the odd one cropped up in the pages of the Scotsman. Archie Dryman was the last. He had been arrested for downloading child porn. Ewan hadn't seen that one coming. When they had been in the rugby team together, Archie had always had a thing about other boys' mums. Shows you could never tell. With the Scotsman tucked under his arm, Ewan waited at the coffee hatch. On the other side was Frida, the coffee lady. Though Norwegian, she had lived in England long enough to intersperse her lilting accent with more guttural Geordie phrases. She enjoyed his self-deprecating humour, in which he managed to make every episode of his life sound like an amusing disaster. "Time for coffee?" Frida asked.
"Yes, and I think I'll treat myself to a Bakewell tart, too. Please."
Frida eyed him closely. "That sounds like you've had a bad day." Ewan gave a grimace to confirm her observation. Frida continued to talk as she poured the coffee from the pot. "You need a break. Go away and forget about your magazine."
"Still trying to get me to Norway."
"Norway is good. The air is clean." She pushed the cup and saucer towards him. "The mountains are fantastic. Might even find a wife," she added with a mischievous smile.
"But you had to come over here to find a husband."
"My second one. My first was Norwegian." Ewan settled down to read The Scotsman at one of the long tables. As he munched his way through his cake, he caught up on the comings and goings of Hearts, his boyhood football team. By the time he had finished his coffee, he was on to the newspaper's arts section. Over the years it had proved useful for pinching ideas to use in his Novo News column. He had been known to use reviews from The Scotsman, virtually word for word, of films he didn't fancy, so he didn't have to see the movies himself. He was about to turn the page over when a small article hidden away at the bottom caught his eye. To be more precise, a name in the first paragraph. He stared at it long and hard. It couldn't be, yet it obviously was. He pushed away his cup and glanced up at the gallery above. A librarian was sorting some books. When Ewan looked back at the newspaper, the name was still there. It was another minute or so before he actually read the piece. The article was little more than a straightforward announcement of the events schedule for the Northern Stars Film Festival. which was starting in a week's time. Yet it unsettled him. Then it gave him an idea. The wind whipped up a discarded crisp packet and tossed it around under the flickering light from the lamp strung across the street. It was cold, and the flurry of snow could soon turn into something heavier. The winter hadn't been as bad as last year, but there was still plenty of time. The crisp packet landed briefly before corkscrewing away into the dark. The man turned his attention to the window on the 4th floor of the building on the other side of the street. He could see the light was still on, though the curtains were drawn, and he knew that she was behind those curtains. What would she be doing at this moment? Watching TV? Having a late meal? Maybe she was painting. He knew she did that. Quite good. He had seen some of her watercolours at that little arty-farty gallery off Lila Torg in the centre of town. He adjusted his baseball cap and pulled his coat collar up against the bitter winter chill. He stamped his feet, but it didn't seem to warm them up. He felt in his pocket for his pack of cigarettes. With gloved hands he found it difficult to extract one. He accomplished the manoeuvre, and even managed to light it after the second attempt. He took a puff and exhaled slowly, the smoke curling its way through the sodium light into the snow. Chapter 2. Brian Fletcher hadn't been enthusiastic when Ewan first mentioned his idea. He naturally assumed that Ewan wanted to skive off to Edinburgh for the day on company expenses. Didn't the Tyneside cinema show enough obscure foreign films without his having to swan off to Scotland?
Look, Brian, this is different.
After seeing the article in The Scotsman, Ewan had spent the next hour on the internet finding out as much as he could. And yes, it had been that Mick Roslin. And yes, he was what the article had claimed, the modern Bergman, even if he wasn't Swedish.
Mick Roslin is huge in Sweden, like,
and Ewan tried to think of a film director whom Brian might have heard of.
Like a Spielberg. No, if he was a Hollywood director.
Brian began as he half-suppressed a burp, confirmation that he had just had a very large pub lunch.
No, the point is that it's a big local success story. Geordie made good in foreign land approach.
Oh, you didn't say he was a Geordie. Brian's interest was now piqued. Ewan had already mentioned that Roslin was from the Heaton area of the city, but Brian hadn't been paying attention at that stage of the conversation.
Yes, he's a Geordie who has conquered Swedish cinema, and he happens to be married to one of their top actresses, Malin Lovgren.
Now Brian really started to look interested.
Blonde, of course.
And very attractive, too, judging by the photos he had managed to find on the web. Typical of Mick, thought Ewan.
And you say this Roslin bloke is going to be at the Northern thingamajig? Yes, he's introducing his latest film, and there's a question and answer session with him afterwards. And will his wife be there?
Brian was already imagining putting a glamorous photo of a sexy Swedish film star on the front page of his magazine. That would impress upstairs.
I don't think so. There's nothing in the article about Malin Lovgren being in Edinburgh, though she stars in the movie.
Brian looked disappointed, but he could still legitimately use her photo if she was involved.
But we'd want more than a review of his film, of course. I could do a big piece on him. The works, local background, how he ended up in Sweden, and how he became a celebrity over there, and part of a glamorous couple. Sort of posh and Bex. More Madonna and Guy Ritchie.
Even Brian had heard of Madonna. His face lit up. He could see the possibilities, and he could scoop the editors of the group's two big local newspapers. He loathed them as much as they despised him. Then doubt crossed over his ample features.
What makes you think you'll get an interview with him? He might not be keen on being associated with such a small... He managed to correct himself. A publication of our size. I think he'll speak to me. We were at university together.
Of course, doubts set in the moment he boarded the train to Edinburgh. When he arrived at Waverley Station, he nearly jumped on the first train back. Mick might not want to see him. He was a big deal now. That was obvious from the way he had adroitly handled the question and answer session after the film had finished. It helped that most of the questions were sycophantic, but he retained that enormous charm he had exercised at Durham. There was no doubting his charisma. Still handsome, still remarkably lean, and still with that arrogant swish of thick black hair, he commanded a room. Always had. The winning smile, the polite way he answered questions, the flashes of humour, but he was good at concealing his ego when it mattered from his public. As Mick held his audience spellbound, Ewan was amused to note that he had lost all traces of his Geordie accent. He had been proud of it once upon a time. In fact, it had been a badge of honour in a university that was awash with public school ponces, as he called them. He made great play of being a Geordie. He even gave the impression of being a working-class hero, even though his family were reasonably well off. That's why the Michael who had turned up at Freshers' Week had become Mick 3 weeks later. His chosen persona went down well with posh girls from down south, their bit of northern rough. He had always been surrounded by attractive women. Sadly, in this case, there was no Malin Lovgren, but he did have a stylish PR woman sitting with him, alongside a young actress who had appeared in a small role in the film as the murdering husband's bit on the side. Ewan didn't catch her full name in the credits, Tilda something, but she was not your archetypal Swedish blonde, quite dark, in fact, but undeniably attractive and appreciably taller than the older Lovgren. Mick didn't introduce her during his talk, so she wasn't there for the publicity. Maybe she was the producer's girlfriend, the producer being an earnest young man with very trendy red-rimmed spectacles, who had taken the stage with Mick but wasn't asked any questions, and whose only contribution to the discussion was to say that Mick Roslin was a brilliant visionary. It was an observation with which Mick seemed entirely in agreement. After a gushing thank you from the festival organiser, the audience started to filter out of the cinema. The organiser was ushering the VIP party out through a side door. The producer attached himself to the young actress. A gentle hand in the small of her back as he guided her out hinted that they were in a relationship. Ewan moved towards the retreating group. Mick was talking to the PR woman when Ewan tried to attract their attention.
"Mick, can I have a word?"
The PR woman turned and with an icy smile said, "Sorry, Mr. Roslin isn't doing any extra interviews at the moment." Ewan ignored her.
"Mick, it's me."
Mick Roslin turned round and looked at Ewan blankly.
Ewan Strachan from uni. Durham."
The PR woman tried to spirit Mick away, but Mick hesitated. He stared hard at the man in front of him. Slowly it began to dawn on him that he recognized the person who was shifting awkwardly from one foot to another. Though standing at 6 foot like himself, the Ewan Strachan he remembered was much thinner, had a lot more reddish hair, certainly not greying and fraying around the temples, and a boyish face. That was gone, though there was still the same twinkle in the deep blue eyes.
"My God,"
Mick said slowly.
"Ewan bloody Strachan. I don't believe it."
"Sorry, Mr. Roslin, we must get on. The Scotsmen want their interview, and then we have to get you to the airport," said the PR woman insistently. Mick held up his hand.
"Isabel, just give me a minute."
His smile part-placated Isabel, who wasn't happy that her timetable was being disrupted, but she didn't want to upset her client. "Only a minute." Mick held out a hand for Ewan to shake.
"What are you doing here?" "Trying to get an interview with the great Swedish-based film director. Journalist?"
His surprise was obvious.
"Thought you'd end up as a teacher. I wouldn't have known what to do with all the holidays." "So, what rag are you working for? A Scottish one, I presume?" "No, in Newcastle, actually."
Mick gave him a quizzical look.
"So you've never escaped. And your newspaper?"
Magazine. You wouldn't have heard of it after your time.
Course I would. My folks still live there. Novo news?
Sample complete. Ready to continue?